Sometimes fate charges a price that not even $5 can afford. Brad Mason noted the property he had just bought for a ridiculous sum, even by the standards of those hard times. The land stretched across acres of parched land, where the grass had long since given up growing. The main house was a wooden skeleton that creaked with every gust of wind, and the barn seemed to have seen better days when Lincoln was still president. But there was something about that desolation that drew him in, something that went beyond the need to start a new life away from the memories that haunted him in the East. The August heat punished mercilessly, creating distorted waves in the air that made the landscape dance like a mirage. Brad took off his hat and ran his shirt sleeve over his sweaty forehead. The broker had disappeared in a cloud of dust as soon as he received the money, leaving behind only the oppressive silence of the desert and a rusty key that looked more like a relic than a functional object. He walked to the porch of the house, where the planks groaned under his feet like old bones, protesting the weight. The front door was unlocked, hanging on its hinges like a tired man leaning against a wall. The interior of the house told a story of abandonment. Cobwebs decorated the corners like macabre lace, and a thick layer of dust covered everything, turning furniture into ghosts of a forgotten past. In the kitchen, Brad found some basic utensils left by the former residents. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner, its surfaces darkened by use and time. On the table, a cup of coffee was still there, as if someone had only left for a few minutes and never returned. The silence was so thick that Brad could hear his own heart beating against his ribs. He decided to explore the barn before the sun began to set. The structure was larger than it appeared from the outside, with tall beams that were lost in the shadows of the ceiling. Bales of rotting hay piled up in a corner, exuding the sweet, cloying smell of decay. Rusty agricultural tools hung on the walls like instruments of medieval torture, and a wheelless cart lay on one side, covered by a torn canvas that fluttered like a flag of surrender. It was when he moved some bales of hay that Brad noticed something strange. The wooden floor there didn't sound the same as the rest when he stepped on. It was a hollow, deeper sound. He knelt down and ran his hands over the boards, feeling small cracks between them that didn't seem natural. With the tip of an old tool, he managed to lift one of the boards. Underneath was a dark opening that descended more than his eye could reach. The air rising from there was cool and laden with moisture, a stark contrast to the dry heat of the desert outside. Brad lit a match and threw it through the opening. The small flame slowly descended, illuminating stone walls until it disappeared into the depths, but not before he realized that it wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a tunnel. He returned to the house while the sun dyed the sky blood red. Sitting on the porch, Brad observed the vastness around him and wondered what kind of secrets a land could hold. The night wind began to blow, bringing with it the distant howl of coyotes and the rustling of dry bushes. He had bought that place to find peace, to hide from the shadows of his past. Now he realized that some shadows were buried much deeper than he had imagined. Night fell like a heavy curtain on the ranch, and Brad prepared for bed, knowing that the next day he would have to make a decision. He could pretend that he had never found that opening, live his simple life raising cattle and planting what the land allowed. Or he could go down into that tunnel and find out what kind of history was buried under his feet. The wind continued to blow outside, and for a moment Brad swore he heard old voices whispering through the cracks in the old wood. Dawn brought with it a decision that Brad already knew was inevitable from the moment he found that opening. He had spent the whole night listening to the wind whisper through the cracks of the old house, as if ancient voices were trying to tell him secrets that time had buried. Now, with the first golden light of day filtering through the dusty windows, he knew he couldn't live in peace without finding out what was deep in that tunnel. He prepared himself as a man prepares for an uncertain journey. He filled a canteen with fresh water from the well, checked to see if he still had enough matches in his pocket, and found an old lantern in the barn that still worked, even though the light was dim and yellowish. He also took a rope he found hanging on a wall in case he needed to go deeper than his legs could take. Back at the opening in the barn floor, Brad removed more planks until he created an entrance large enough to pass through. The initial descent was steep, but there were steps crudely carved into the rock, as if someone had spent a lot of time turning that hole into a usable passageway. The walls were damp to the touch, and water droplets slowly dripped off, creating small puddles on the stone floor. As it descended, the temperature grew milder, a welcome relief after the scorching heat up there. The tunnel stretched in a direction that Brad calculated was north, toward the distant mountains he had seen on the horizon. The construction was rudimentary but solid, clearly done by someone who knew what he was doing and had enough time to do it right. After walking for about 200 meters, Brad came to a fork. The main tunnel was still straight, but there was a smaller passage that veered to the right. He decided to move on first, but he made a mental note of the location of the secondary passage. The air below carried a strange smell, a mixture of damp earth and something metallic that he could not identify. That's when his flashlight illuminated something that made him stop abruptly. On the walls, carved into the stone with some kind of sharp tool, were symbols and words. He zoomed in on the light and was able to distinguish names, dates, and short messages. Jacob Miller, 1847. May God forgive us. Sarah found peace down here, 1849. Gold is not worth a man's soul. Thomas. Brad felt a shiver run down his spine. Those messages were not from explorers or adventurers. They were desperate people who had used that tunnel to hide from something. And the dates coincided with a period he knew well from the history books, the California gold rush years, when men went mad with greed and did things that haunted their consciences forever. He continued walking and soon reached a larger chamber, a kind of room dug into the rock. There were clear signs of prolonged occupation. Remnants of ancient fires blackened the ceiling, and piles of small animal bones indicated that someone had hunted and cooked down there. On one of the walls, a rudimentary shelf still held some objects, an empty bottle, pieces of fabric, and something that made Brad's heart race, a small leather bag, still well-maintained despite the years. Inside, Brad found gold coins. Not many, maybe enough to buy supplies for a few weeks, but definitely real gold, and along with the coins, a folded piece of paper, yellowed by time but still legible. The message was short and written in hurried handwriting. If anyone finds this, know that Henry Coleman was not a thief. What we took belonged to men who murdered entire families for fun. We use these tunnels to take the gold back to widows and orphans. May God judge if we did it right. The rest is hidden where the eagle flies highest. Brad folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. The story was beginning to make sense. That tunnel was not the work of a single man, but of an organized group. People who had decided to take the law into their own hands at a time when the official law had not yet reached those lands. Vigilantes who stole from murderers to give to the families of the victims. He explored a little more and found that the tunnel continued much further than he had imagined. There were other chambers, other forks, a whole underground system that probably stretched for miles. But his flashlight was getting weak, and he knew it would be unwise to venture deeper without better preparation. On the way back to the surface, Brad carried more questions than answers. Who were these people? What had happened to them? And especially, where the hell did the eagle fly the highest? Sitting on the porch of his new home, watching the sunset over his $5 property, Brad realized that he had bought much more than land and old wood. I had bought a story, and stories he knew very well always charged a price for being told. Brad spent the next 3 days watching the sky with an attention that bordered on obsession. The phrase, "where the eagle flies the highest," echoed in his mind like a distant bell, and he knew the answer was right there, before his eyes, waiting to be deciphered. During the day, I walked around the property mentally mapping every elevation, every rock formation, every solitary tree that could serve as a reference point. It was on the morning of the fourth day that the answer came to him in an almost insulting way in its simplicity. He was repairing a fence when he saw the shadow pass over his head. He looked up, and there she was, a red-tailed eagle soaring majestically toward the highest mountain peak to the north. The same peak that could be clearly seen from his balcony, silhouetted against the sky like a natural pyramid of stone and earth. That afternoon, Brad prepared for a longer journey. He filled his backpack with water, a few pieces of jerky, and a small shovel he found in the barn. If there was something hidden up there, it was probably buried. He also took the flashlight in case he found more tunnels or caves on the mountain. The hike to the foot of the mountain took 2 hours under the punishing sun. The terrain was rough and full of loose stones that rolled under his feet with every step. Prickly bushes grabbed his clothes like desperate fingers, and more than once he had to stop to remove thorns from his boots. But something propelled him forward, a sense that he was about to discover something important, something that would change his understanding of everything. The climb up the mountain was even more challenging. There was no set trail, just rocks and rocks forming a jagged path towards the top. Brad had to use his hands several times, turning the climb into a dangerous man-rock dance. The heat was suffocating, and sweat ran down his face, forming small streams of salt and dust. When it finally reached the peak, the sun was already beginning its descent towards the western horizon. The view from there was breathtaking. His property looked like a small brown dot in the yellowish expanse of the desert, and he could see for miles in all directions. But it wasn't the landscape that caught his attention. It was a rock formation in the center of the peak, a pile of rocks that was clearly unnatural. The stones had been carefully stacked, forming a kind of landmark or monument. And at the base of that pile, Brad found what he was looking for: a flat stone slab with carved symbols, an eagle with its wings spread out, and underneath it an arrow pointing downwards. He moved the slab with difficulty, and underneath he found a hole dug in the solid rock of the mountain. Inside the hole was a small wooden chest, surprisingly well maintained, considering how long it must have been there. The locks had rusted long ago, and Brad was able to open them with the tip of his knife. What he saw inside made his breath stop for a moment. Gold. Much more gold than I expected. Coins, nuggets, even some pieces of jewelry that must have belonged to someone important. But there was more than gold inside. Carefully protected documents in waxed cloth told a story that made Brad understand the true extent of what he had discovered. The papers were meticulous records kept by someone named Henry Coleman, the same name as the message he found in the tunnel. Lists of names, dates, amounts of money returned to widows and orphans. It was the record of an operation that lasted years, an organized group of men who decided to do justice in a land where official justice did not yet exist. One letter in particular caught his eye. It was from a woman named Margaret Wilson, thanking Henry for the sum that had come to her after her husband and children were killed by bandits. She wrote about how that money had allowed her and her young daughter to survive the winter and start a new life in an eastern city. But the most revealing document was a rudimentary map showing the location of other caches. The tunnel system was just the beginning. There were at least 6 points marked within a 20-kilometer radius, each identified by different symbols. Henry Coleman and his companions had created a whole network of operations, stealing from criminals and bandits to give back to their victims. Brad sat on the stone and watched the sun go down as he processed everything he had discovered. These men had risked their lives to do what they thought was right at a time when doing right could cost a person's life. Were they bandits? Were they heroes? The line between the two was as blurred as the footprints in the desert dust. When night fell completely, Brad carefully put away the documents and the map, but left the gold where it was. It wasn't his, it never would be. That treasure belonged to history, to the memories of the men who had died to protect him, and to the families who had been saved by him. Descending the mountain in the darkness, guided only by the dim light of his flashlight and the silhouette of his distant home, Brad realized that his life had changed forever. He had bought a ranch for $5 and discovered that some inheritances are priceless. But he also knew that the story was not over. The map in his pocket showed other locations, other secrets waiting to be discovered. And something told him that Henry Coleman and his men still had stories to tell. The visit arrived on a September morning when the heat was still biting but had already lost the ferocity of summer. Brad was repairing the roof of the house when he saw the cloud of dust approaching from the road. A lone rider, mounted on a dark horse that seemed to have traveled a considerable distance. Something about the way the man moved in the saddle made Brad get off the roof and keep his hand close to the gun he now carried with him. The visitor was a middle-aged man with gray hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He wore simple but well-groomed clothes, and there was a certain dignity in his movements that spoke of politeness and good manners. When he stopped in front of the house, he took off his hat in a respectful greeting. The man introduced himself as Thomas Whitman and explained that he had been a lawyer in a city 2 days away. He said he learned by chance that someone had bought the Coleman's old property and decided to come and find out in person. His words were careful, measured, like someone testing the ground before taking the next step. Brad offered water and shade, and the two men sat on the porch as the sun continued its relentless march across the sky. Thomas spoke about Henry Coleman as if he had known him personally. He said that Henry had been a good man who had arrived in that region with simple dreams of raising cattle and living in peace. But times were violent, and good men sometimes had to make choices that would haunt them forever. It was then that Thomas asked the question Brad had been waiting for since the moment he saw the night approaching. He asked if Brad had found anything interesting in his new property. Something in the older man's eyes suggested that he already knew the answer, that this visit was no coincidence. Brad made a decision that surprised himself. He told everything: the tunnel, the messages on the walls, the treasure on the mountain, the documents that revealed the true history of the Colemans and their companions. Thomas listened in silence, only waving from time to time as someone confirming details of an already known story. When Brad finished, Thomas was silent for a long time, staring at the horizon where the heat created dancing mirages. Finally, he began to speak, and his voice carried the weight of years of guarded secrets. Thomas revealed that he had been a lawyer not only for Henry Coleman, but for the entire group. He knew every man who had participated in that operation of justice, every family that had been helped, every bandit who had been stripped of their ill-gotten gains. He himself had helped plan many of the operations, using his legal knowledge to identify criminals that official law could not reach. The story Thomas told was more complex and dangerous than Brad had imagined. The Colemans and their men were not simple vigilantes. They operated in a network that stretched across several states, coordinating efforts with other similar groups, sharing information about bandits and their routes. It was almost a military organization, dedicated to protecting innocents in a land where official protection was scarce or non-existent. But there was a price to pay for this life. Thomas told how, one by one, the members of the group had been hunted down by vengeful thugs and corrupt officials who profited from the chaos. Henry Coleman was the last to disappear in 1852, after an ambush that Thomas suspected was set up by a sheriff bought by local criminals. The reason for Thomas's visit became clear when he explained that he had spent the last 20 years trying to locate all the hiding places the group had created, not for the gold, but for the documents that proved crimes that had never been tried, atrocities that had gone unpunished. Thomas wanted to make sure that those stories were not lost, that the families of the victims finally knew the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Brad showed him the map he had found, and Thomas studied the symbols with the recognition of someone who had participated in his creation. It confirmed that there were at least 3 other sites that contained not only gold, but detailed records of crime and criminals, documents that could finally bring justice even after so many years. Thomas made a proposal that Brad didn't expect. He suggested that they work together to locate the other hiding places. Thomas had the knowledge and experience. Brad had the energy and the means to do the necessary digging. And more importantly, they both had the same goal: to make sure that the truth didn't die buried in the desert. But Thomas also brought a grim warning. There were people still alive who benefited from the crimes that Henry Coleman and his men tried to combat. Powerful families who built fortunes on blood and suffering, and who would not hesitate to kill to protect their secrets. Searching for the other hiding places would be dangerous, perhaps deadly. As the sun began to set, Thomas prepared to leave. He said he would be back in a week with more detailed supplies and maps if Brad decided to accept his proposal. Before mounting the horse, he handed Brad an old revolver in a leather bag. It was Henry Coleman's gun, Thomas explained, and if Brad was going to continue the work Henry started, he would need to be prepared for the dangers that would come with him. Watching Thomas disappear into a cloud of dust toward the road, Brad weighed the revolver in his hands and wondered if he was ready to carry the burden Henry Coleman had left behind. The desert guarded its secrets jealously, but some secrets, he began to realize, required blood to be revealed. Thomas returned exactly 1 week later as promised, but he did not come alone. 3 men accompanied him, riding in military formation that made Brad immediately understand that his quiet life had come to an end. The visitors were not friends. The leader of the group was a tall, thin man with scars that cut through his face like maps of ancient violence. He introduced himself as Marcus Thorne and spoke with the authority of someone who is used to being obeyed without question. He said that he represented certain families who had an interest in the objects Brad had found on his property. Thomas was bound and gagged over his mount, his eyes conveying a silent apology. There was dried blood on his face, evidence that he tried to resist before being captured. Marcus explained that Thomas had made the mistake of asking too many questions in the wrong city, and that certain people had remembered his connections to Henry Coleman. The negotiation Marcus proposed was simple and brutal. Brad would hand over all the documents and maps he had found, reveal the location of all the hiding places he knew, and in return, his life would be spared. Refusing would mean immediate death for him and Thomas. Brad felt the weight of Henry Coleman's revolver on his belt and made a decision that surprised even himself. He said he needed to get the documents inside the house, and Marcus waved for one of his men to accompany him. It was the mistake Brad expected. Inside the house, away from the eyes of the other attackers, Brad moved with speed he didn't even know he possessed. Henry Coleman's revolver once spoke, and Marcus's henchman fell heavily on the old wooden floor. The sound of gunfire echoed through the desert like a bell announcing that peace was over. The ensuing battle was brief but intense. Brad knew his property better than any visitor. He knew where every shade offered protection and every corner allowed for an ambush. He used this knowledge as Henry Coleman had used the tunnels decades earlier, turning familiarity into lethal advantage. Marcus died trying to flee towards the horses, a bullet from Brad finding his back when he was within a few feet of freedom. The third man surrendered when he realized that he was alone against someone who was fighting not only for his life, but for something bigger than himself. Thomas, freed from his bonds, revealed how he had been captured. His investigations had caught the attention of people who preferred that the past remain buried. Families that built respectability on stolen fortunes, politicians whose grandparents had profited from protection, sold to criminals. The network of corruption that Henry Coleman fought had not disappeared. It had just become more sophisticated. In the days that followed, Brad and Thomas worked together to locate the other hiding places. They found documents that revealed crimes that shocked even Thomas, who thought he knew the full extent of the evil Henry Coleman had faced. Evidence of covert massacres, of authorities bought, of entire families killed to protect trade secrets. But the most important discovery came in the last hiding place they explored, in a cave in the mountains to the west. There they found not only gold and documents, but a personal diary of Henry Coleman that told his side of the story. The pages revealed a man tormented by the choices he had made, but determined to use violence as a last resort to protect innocence. Henry had written of his doubts, his sleepless nights, his certainty that he would be killed before he saw real justice established in that land. But he had also written about hope that one day someone would continue the work he had begun, that truth would finally prevail over brute force. Thomas took the most important documents to federal authorities in far-flung cities, places where local corruption had not reached. Some of the crimes were too old for punishment, but others resulted in investigations that brought down powerful families and exposed decades of covert injustices. Brad kept his $5 property, but now he knew he had paid a much higher price for it. The gold they found was donated to an orphanage in a nearby town, fulfilling the spirit of Henry Coleman's original mission. The tunnels were sealed, their secrets finally revealed to the world. Months later, when autumn brought relief from the relentless summer heat, Brad sat on his renovated porch and watched the sunset paint the desert gold and red. The land had produced a good harvest. Its few animals were healthy, and for the first time since he had arrived there, he felt true peace. Thomas visited occasionally, bringing news of lawsuits and families who had finally received justice decades overdue. But mostly he came to sit in companionly silence and look out over the same horizon that Henry Coleman had contemplated years before. Henry Coleman's revolver stood in a place of honor over Brad's mantelpiece, not as a symbol of violence, but as a reminder that sometimes good men have to make difficult choices to protect those who can't protect themselves. Brad had bought a ranch for $5 and discovered that some inheritances are priceless. Justice, he had learned, did not always come with badges or hammers. Sometimes it comes at the hands of ordinary men willing to pay the price of doing what is right, no matter the personal cost. And in the wilderness that witnessed so much violence and suffering, there was finally a place where peace could grow like grass after the rain, rare, precious, and won with the blood and determination of men who refused to accept that evil prevailed over good. If you've made it this far, it's because the stories of the Wild West awaken something special in you, that thirst for justice, adventure, and mysteries buried in time. This channel is dedicated to telling these epic narratives that marked an era where ordinary men made extraordinary choices. Sign up now so you don't miss any of these exciting journeys through the wild heart of the American West.